Hi, my name is Ken Salle. I'm a novelist, monologuist. I used to be a playwright. I write a lot of stuff out here in Southern California. One of those things I write is this show, DC Home. DC Home is the story of people living in our American political society. I talk about how Washington, D.C. has directly impacted our lives, which is something D.C. is doing a lot these days. Impacting. Back in February, I began talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic was impacting the lives of those people in their D.C. homes. Those people, by the way, included Sherry Finn, her nephew Sean. They were put out of their home by Trump when he shut down the government back in 2019. Elections have consequences, and theirs was to be homeless for a while. But thanks to folks like Old Herbert, Tony, Daisy, and so many others, Sherry and her nephew found a home inside a storage unit at the DC Home Storage out behind all the shops in Fort Lincoln. Sherry found a job over at WGNO, and if nothing else, at least their plummet into abject poverty was abated. Somewhat. But then, as I mentioned back in February, the shroud of COVID fell upon our nation. And shroud is the right word for it. A death shroud large enough to fit 180,000, 200,000, 250,000. At some point, the number of dead will render this recording painfully out of touch. And yet, the Republican Party, the party that holds the White House, controls Congress, has a stranglehold on the courts, the party in complete control of our nation, refuses to do anything to help. And in fact, does everything it can to kill more and more Americans. And for month after month, I told the stories of these people living at DC Home Storage. And for month after month, everything got worse. And for month after month, the Republicans refused to do anything about it. And then, just about 2 months ago, my wife stood in the doorway of my studio as I sat behind my desk. I looked up into her eyes and listened to her tell me that her COVID-19 test had come back positive. And just like that, COVID-19 had found its way into my life in the worst way imaginable. In all of the many times I'd considered COVID-19 finding its way into my family, I had always thought I'd be the one to bring it home. Vicki and I are both incredibly cautious people with regards to this pandemic. We think, just as a rule, that when something is called a pandemic, caution is generally a good idea. But as safe as I am, I marvel at how cautious my wife is. And yet, and for the next 15 or so minutes, I contemplated what this would mean. I considered the cough that would take over my wife's chest. I assumed that this would make it difficult for her to breathe. And from everything I've heard over and over and over and over, I guessed she would then be put on a respirator at some point. And that would be it. I tend to worry about things a bit. But I only considered this for about 15 minutes, the suffering my wife would go through, the pain my wife would go through, and the inevitable death. And then I realized that I had been kissing my wife and sharing drinks with my wife and sleeping right next to my wife. And if she had COVID, odds were pretty good that I did too. which was good, because there was no way I was leaving my wife. Call me old-fashioned, but I think plague duties just come with the wedding vows. My wife had been tested initially because she needed shoulder surgery, and the test was to clear her for that surgery. Now the surgery would need to be put off, and this is the really great part, neither of us would know if we were COVID-free for an entire month. For 1 month, most of July and a taste of August, we quarantined. We stayed indoors but to walk the dogs. We ordered in. We had our groceries delivered. We paid through the nose. There's something you never hear about on the news, the cost of quarantining. And at the end of the month, we were found to be COVID-free. But during that month, you better believe we were watching each other, waiting for the shoe or the spouse to fall. And as we waited, I considered the folks at DC Home. Because I still have 3 episodes left this season, one of which I am thoughtlessly taking up right now. And somebody's got to write them. And I would sit at my desk, fingers perched on the keyboard, totally unable to write. Who can write when death is 19? And I thought about the folks at DC Home. You see, I had been writing about their COVID experiences, having never been personally impacted by it myself. And then, having spent a month in that world, never, ever sure if I had it, wondering what would happen to the love of my life, I began to understand that I could never again write their COVID stories. Because I could see how every COVID story is intensely personal. It's not just a disease. It's a specter. It's a destroyer of families, of worlds. And though no one said this to me, I began to find my sharing of their personal stories a little crass. Now, I have no problem telling you about old Herbert's latest embarrassment, which has been his insistence that you could, technically, cover up the word lives on 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., where Black Lives Matter is written in the street. Now, his point is that lives is a starting point and not an end point, that respect starts where lives are acknowledged. Sadly, old Herbert's elocution lessons are far in the past, and Miss Alicia's passing is, well, very much a part of the present. So, when he was shouting, "It's not your lives that matter," at the protests outside of the White House, I want you to understand that his heart was in the right place. Sean and Alicia stopped being a thing. Not that they ever were a thing, but one of Sean's friends turned him on to some new OnlyFans, and, well, Alicia was coming around the corner, and, well, so was Sean. But enough of young love. After my wife had her shoulder surgery, any hope of returning to DC Home was lost to me. After nearly losing her to the plague, and yes, I know she had no symptoms, but I think the concern is understandable. I now had to tend to her, half of her upper body trussed up in a sling like some reminder of how life is too short for telling tales. Fortunately, Vicky is doing much better, and I'm happy to say I am slowly returning to work. Alan Oswald Watts is also slowly on the mend, having taken up residence for a short time at the East Falls Church Metro Station down by Benjamin Benneker Park beneath the Custis Memorial Parkway. But as anyone who has tried to live for any length of time in a metro station will tell you, they're incredibly nasty. Even if you stick to the indoor plumbing. You assume everyone else will avoid it because of COVID and filthy surfaces and infection, but no, because men are disgusting in every circumstance, and that's about it. Once he was on the mend and could talk into a phone for 10 minutes, Alan Oswald Watts put decades of hard work as a highly paid Republican operative through the focus built from hosting his own drive-time radio show. And out came the purest stream of begging for money, a place to stay, food to eat. Oh yeah, sure, there was plenty of that. But then you add to that the most amazing sense of entitlement, that Alan Oswald Watts was too good to be left on the side of the road. Alan Oswald Watts was a fixture in the Republican Party. He was a figure in the movement, and nobody was going to steal that from him like some dirty Democrat. And while every person on the known world refused to take his calls, there was one organization that didn't mind considering itself beneath the level of people. They slid on their bellies and reproduced asexually beneath bathroom stalls. They were, of course, the Republican Defamation League. If you know the Lincoln Project, then you have some idea of the exact opposite of the Republican Defamation League, or RDL for short. While the Lincoln Project exposes Republican lies, the RDL, they put Alan Oswald Watts in a room in the Hyatt for the entire month of July. The entire month. Free meals, free HBO, and they never once bothered Alan Oswald Watts. He thought he was in heaven. He slept in. He rested. He made sure he was feeling better and that the disease was no longer a part of him. Oh, sure, he had some difficulty with stairs. His lungs just couldn't take him. But Alan Oswald Watts didn't know how long he would benefit from this gift, though he had made sure to threaten his benefactors with all of the inside information he knew, secret stashes of information online, an unassailable reputation with possibly as many as tens of thousands of retired voters that Trump would need delivered if he would ever hold on to the White House with any resemblance of the possibility of truth. The RDL showed Alan Oswald Watts that he held all of the cards. Trump might even appoint him to whatever cabinet post had been abandoned that week, too. The end of WGNO was not the end of Alan Oswald Watts. It was only the... And then the police broke down the door to his hotel room. They just broke it down. And they had their guns drawn. And they were yelling. And Alan Oswald Watts was in his bathrobe. Nothing else. And they dragged him out, beating him when he resisted. Alan Oswald Watts realized they weren't wearing police uniforms. They didn't read him his rights. They beat him in the face with their guns until he lost consciousness somewhere in the hallway of the hotel. And woke up wet and very cold in several inches of what he was really hoping was water in an empty lot in the midst of... Where was he? A vague figure stood above him, but to be fair, Alan Oswald Watts wasn't seeing very well. The figure informed Alan Oswald Watts that he was no longer a concern. He had been killed. Here was his obituary. Here were pictures of his self-asphyxiation. It was amazing what you could do with Photoshop. Here were video clips of him spouting communist beliefs, his endorsing Marianne Williamson, him explaining how to deliver a really stellar blowjob. And Alan Oswald Watts was told a story explaining just how lucky he was that they didn't just put a bullet in his head. And Alan Oswald Watts was told exactly the price of a single bullet. And Alan Oswald Watts knew. He wasn't sure what he knew. He laid there in that muck, in the mud, in the middle of that lot as the vague figure and several other large men walked away with no idea what he knew, but he knew. For some, COVID-19 is the beginning of the story. For some, it's the end. But for some who experience the touch of COVID-19 on their lives, it is but a midpoint, an illumination on just where we are in our days here on earth. A reminder that we are very small, all of us. Nobody is beyond COVID-19, and nobody will do anything to stop COVID-19. Washington, D.C. has its hands in all of our homes. Welcome to D.C. Home. Until next time, be good to yourself, be kind to others, and let's make this world a better place. This is Ken LaSalle, and I just wanted to thank you for stopping by for this episode of DC Home. For more information about myself and the work I do, I invite you to take a look at my website at kenlasalle.com. You can also find me on Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and anywhere you find ebooks, paperback books, and audiobooks online. That's also where you'd find DC Home Season 1, available in ebook and in audio. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching my name, Ken LaSalle. And thank you, as always, for your support.